Welcome to Loper Bright versus Raimondo and Relentless versus Department of Commerce. This is a case about the appropriate balance of power between administrative agencies which implement the law and courts that interpret the law. This case is really about fishermen who are just trying to run their business and the power of executive agencies to impose extensive regulations. So, what did the media say about this case? It's important to remember as public health professionals that even mainstream media can use different headlines to try and grab readers' attention. What this means is they can use words to inflate, manipulate, or even mislead the facts about what's actually going on and what this means. Let's take a look at what happened in this case. The Supreme Court issued a ruling, and here was a sampling of some of the news headlines. The LA Times said, with the Chevron ruling, the Supreme Court claims to be smarter than scientific experts. AP News said, Supreme Court undercuts federal regulators, and executive branch agencies will have more difficulty regulating public health. NPR ran a similar headline, and it took quite a few headlines to get to something like Forbes that actually either approved of the decision or alternatively said what the decision did in plain facts. And this matters because your role as a public health professional is to provide information in a clear, straightforward way. So, who did the case involve? What was actually going on here? So, Loper Bright was a combination of several different cases. There was a few different groups of fishermen who were objecting to how a federal agency called the National Marine Fisheries Service was regulating their business. The argument was the National Marine Fisheries Service had overstepped its authority when it was imposing new regulations, and Congress didn't grant it the power to do that. So let's back up. Congress had passed this law called the Magnuson-Stevens Act. This had delegated power to the National Marine Fisheries Service to enact regulations to prevent overfishing. So the National Marine Fisheries Service passed different rules that required fishing vessels to have something called onboard observers to make sure that the fishing vessels and the fishermen were complying with these regulations to prevent overfishing and restrictions on overfishing. But in some cases, these new regulations also required the fishermen to pay for these onboard observers. And in certain cases, this significantly cut into the fishermen's profits, in some instances by 20%. So this type of regulation also affected different sizes of businesses differently. So you can imagine the larger businesses could perhaps absorb some of this cost, the smaller businesses not as much. So let's get to the issue of agency power. The significance of this case, besides the fishermen and trying to run their business, is about the balance of appropriate power between administrative agencies, which implement the law, and courts that are designed to interpret the law based on what the Constitution says. So here's a little refresher on the difference between legislation, what Congress does, and regulation, what executive agencies do. So Congress gives power to the executive agency through an enabling statute. This gives directions on how it wants the executive agency to act. It lays out the purpose of the law and the scope of the agency's authority. So remember, under the Constitution, the separation of powers, this issue is that agencies do not have power to make different decisions or do things on their own. They're given that power, in this case by Congress, and they're using their expertise to flesh out and to implement a specific directive that Congress has given them. Back in the 1940s, Congress was worried about administrative agencies accumulating too much power, and they were worried about them turning into the administrative state. So Congress passed something in the 1940s called the Administrative Procedures Act. Now, this law specifically states really clearly that if there's a question of what a particular law means, a court must interpret that. And the court is required to interpret the statute according to what Congress said the agency should be doing. Congress must look at The court must look at Congress's intent and also to make sure that the agency was acting reasonably within its boundaries, that is, not acting with too much power or grabbing too much authority that was not delegated to it through the federal law. So, what's this about Chevron in the news? This case, Loper Bright, struck down an old case called Chevron versus the National Resources Defense Council. This was a case back from 1984. And the test from this particular case is sometimes called the Chevron two step, which makes me think of a cowboy two step dance. So, Chevron versus National Resources Defense Council looked at this question of, well, what should happen if an agency is using its power, but there's a party that objects and says Congress didn't grant the agency power to do that, or I think the law actually means something else. So that's what the Chevron case was about, is what happens if Congress passes a law and it looks ambiguous? So this is what the Chevron case back in 1984 said. It said, okay, first question, did Congress actually speak to the issue? That means if Congress's intent is clear, then courts need to preserve what Congress's intent was. And if the agency is doing something contrary to that, then the court must reject that. Okay? Step two, said Chevron, is, well, wait a minute. If Congress passed a law, but it looks silent or ambiguous on a particular issue, okay, then we're going to give the executive agency some deference and let the agency interpret what they think the law should mean, as long as it's reasonable. So that was the Chevron two step. So what happened in this case of Loper Bright? Back to the fishermen. So this was a group of herring fishermen who were challenging this regulation, and they were claiming that the National Marine Fisheries Service could not require them to cover these costs of onboard observers and the compliance costs, because they were saying Congress never actually gave power to the National Marine Fisheries Service to do that. In essence, they were saying the National Marine Fisheries Service was grabbing too much power and it overstepped its authority as an executive agency. So the court's decision was looking at this balance of power between the Supreme Court to interpret the law, executive agencies to administer and flesh out the law, and Congress to give that power to the executive agencies. So what happened in this case? The Supreme Court overruled Chevron, that two-step test, and said that wasn't decided correctly. And it was looking at what federal law said before that, the Administrative Procedures Act, that said really clearly, unequivocally, if there's a question of law and Congress hasn't made it clear, then if it's a question of law, courts must interpret that question of law. And it's the court's job to make sure that the agency is doing what the law says it's supposed to be doing. So, what was the problem with Chevron deference, said the Supreme Court? Well, it contradicts the Administrative Procedures Act, right? It's giving too much deference to the agency, but it was also stopping courts from reviewing agency actions. So it was kind of like a rubber stamp. As long as it looked reasonable, courts would give the agency a pass. And the Supreme Court said this isn't right. And it's also giving agencies too much power, in some cases that hasn't been delegated to the particular agency. And agencies love to give themselves more power. So, what's the argument on the other side? So, some were saying, well, agencies are the subject matter experts. They know all of the scientific and the technical knowledge. And the court's response to this was, well, agencies can use their scientific and technical expertise when they're fleshing out how the law should apply. Of course, that's their job. But if the law is unclear or ambiguous, then it's the court's job to interpret what the law means. And of course, if there's a party that's challenging the law, The agency, along with other scientific and technical experts, can submit different briefs to the court to say, well, this is the definition that should prevail, and here's why, and try and persuade or convince the court of their interpretation. So, what does the decision actually mean? The decision does not undercut agencies or claim that judges are smarter about scientific issues. It simply says that agencies will decide how to implement laws. But if there's a question about what the law itself means, a legal question, this is for the courts to interpret. So, a little historical tidbit too, because there was a lot of politics in the news about that, is it was actually conservatives who were initially praising the Chevron decision and said, this is a good thing that we're giving executive agencies more deference or more power back in 1984. Today, it's flip flopped. And it's liberals that say, oh no, you're taking away power from the agencies. So, what does the flip flop in political reasoning matter? Well, it gets to the principle of how much power do you want executive agencies to have, particularly if the party in power at that executive agency is the party with which you disagree. So that's a good limiting principle on how much power executive agencies should have. And additionally, this is based on separation of powers in the Constitution. So it's a good test to figure out how to limit authority fairly. Another thing to think about with this case is it does not affect other decisions that have already happened that have relied on Chevron deference. And finally, how will this decision affect other decisions in public health? So there's a lot of other cases involving agencies that implement or regulate in the area of public health that cross the political spectrum. So, a couple of examples here, two different examples would be where agencies are interpreting a word in a certain way to either give themselves more power or act in a way to regulate industries in what some say is too lax of a manner. So, two different areas where this has come up. So, one example would be an expansion of power where an agency is taking one particular law and saying, this gives us the power to do something else. So, one example of this would be back during COVID-19, the CDC used a particular public health law that gave it power to fumigate, inspect, and disinfect places and items to instead issue a moratorium on landlords enforcing collecting rent payments and stopping evictions. On the flip side of this, some liberal and progressive minded environmental health experts say that the Federal Communications Commission is not acting according to how Congress directed, and in fact is acting in too lax of a way, that is, interpreting its mandate too loosely, and is not creating appropriate standards for non ionizing radiation for wireless technology such as 5G and cell phones that might affect the public's health. So you can see two different examples of either taking too much power or having too lax of standards based on how an agency might interpret particular words in the statute. So what's the takeaway? Agencies still have authority to use their expertise to implement laws, but this case is upholding the separation of powers in the Constitution. This concludes the video.